So every week, my team and I visit crews who work on board cargo ships. You know the ones. They are those enormous vessels that dock in the port of Seattle. It's what we do at the Mission to Seafarers. We welcome and care for seafarers who visit Seattle from all over the world. And one of the ways that happens is through these ship visits. Now, typically, we meet with crew in a ship's office, or sometimes in a mess hall. Sometimes we meet with them in a kitchen, so then it's just like it is at home. And sometimes we meet in main engineering, and that's always quite impressive because engines that run those ships are enormous. But there is one place that we rarely go, and that is onto the bridge of a ship. So I have been on board at least 100 container ships in my 2 years serving at the mission, and I have only been on board a bridge 4 times. It is rare for those invitations to come, and so then when they do, we jump at that opportunity. So the last time that I went on a bridge, which was in April, with a youth group from Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church in West Seattle, the chief officer was so thrilled to see all of us. First of all, that surprised me that they would be happy to see about a dozen teenagers and then all of us from the mission. Because we were there, they invited us to actually go up onto the bridge. And as soon as we got there, he was really excited and actually kind of anxious to show us something. And it turns out that what he wanted to show us was the ship's new computerized navigation system. So it was displayed on a monitor that is about the size of the altar, so it was huge. It was tucked away behind a wall full of maps, so old-style paper maps, and this wall went from ceiling to floor, so it basically blocked the view out the front window. And it was next to an espresso machine. So every bridge I have been on has an espresso machine. So I thought he would be excited to show us about this new piece of equipment, but instead he complained. It turns out that modern navionics are kind of like our phones and our computers and the GPSs in our cars. That is because they crash often and usually at very inconvenient times. And so this particular machine, navionics machine, had a habit of crashing when harbor pilots were bringing the vessel in and berthing the ship, which is the most critical time when it needs to work. So then the chief shared something that was not very reassuring. He told me that they were relieved that they had an old magnetic compass on board the vessel. And most, I think probably all, in fact, all container ships have magnetic compasses, and I think many other boats do too. So he told me that the navigation officer always verified the coordinates that the navigation computer would show. He always verified it against the compass. And then, when that lovely machine failed at sea, that compass, along with the sextant and the paper maps, those were the 2 or the 3 things that kept them from losing their way. So ships, they are not the only ones who get lost at sea and lose their way. So do us. So do we as God's people. And we hear that today in both of these readings. Those same readings reveal to us that Jesus is always there, guiding us back on course when we lose our way. So the gospel today, it's a difficult one. It sounds less like the good news of Jesus Christ and more like the headlines that you and I read in our favorite news sources. And if you read the news or you listened to the news this morning, you probably were wondering whether or not we got the text mixed up, because it sounds a whole lot like the news we hear all the time. So every year I find it harder to endure this passage. The current context that we live in, it is filled with conflict. And rather than dissipating, these divisions among us seem to be growing at an escalating pace. And I wonder if there is good news in that. But I think that this was Jesus' point. Jesus does admit that his presence and his ministry will bring conflict. But there is more to this passage. There are more layers to the story. So today's gospel, I think that it functions both as a mirror and as an icon. So first, the mirror. So Jesus holds up a mirror to us, and he says to us, look, you all live in a society where division is not just the norm, it is the goal. And that division that you deal with in your daily life, guess what? It distracts you on purpose from the things that really matter. The conflict that arises because of that then isolates you from yourself and from other people who matter greatly to you. And then the dissension that you feel within yourself causes you to question identity, your own identity, and the values that matter to you. And ultimately, that division, it tries to make you lose your sense of self. It tries to make you forget who you are. And that is a beloved, good child of God, an important, integral part of God's creation. This passage makes us uncomfortable, and that is because Jesus names for us the current state of our world. We recognize the image that is staring back at us in that mirror because it is the reality that confronts us every day. This passage is hard to hear precisely because we know how hard it is to live in that world. But this passage also functions as an icon. Jesus urges us to see the holy beyond the current present state of things. And if we stick with Jesus long enough, that is where we will find the good news. Jesus admits that he is under stress until his baptism is complete. But this is not the everyday stress that you and I deal with. It is different than fretting about money or the difficult conversation that you need to have with your child or your parent, or about whether or not the person who coughed next to you in the store is COVID positive. Instead, the source of Jesus' stress is different. Jesus worries about fulfillment. And until Jesus' mission is complete, God's impact in this world will remain unfinished. God's vision for you and I will remain incomplete. And the life-giving, liberating love of God, it will remain a proof of concept for most, rather than the standard operating procedure for everyone. So for Jesus to be complete, you and I need to be complete as well. And that is what Jesus is stressed about. So that's where the division that Jesus brings actually is a good thing. Because Jesus names for us the things that separate us from God and separate us from each other. And then Jesus assures us that he will do everything in his power to remove those things, to clear the path for us. Or to go back to that maritime metaphor, Jesus assures us that he will pull us back on track when we veer off course. So there is this cultural allergy to conflict and division. And rather than engaging with it, many of us are conditioned to shy away from it. And I will name for you that I am one of those people. I told everyone that at 8 o'clock, before I went off to seminary, I took one of these surveys. And the survey came back and said that I was off the chart on conflict avoidance. That was my way of dealing with conflict. It was avoiding it altogether. And I bet some of you can relate to that too. So going along with the crowd, sometimes it seems easier than standing up for what matters. and conforming to the norm. That may take less energy rather than celebrating the unique giftedness that is inside each one of us. But over time, those actions constrain and limit who you and I really are. And they constrain and limit who Jesus is and calling us to be. They drain us of energy, and they cause us to forget who we are. And if those actions persist long enough, eventually we lose sight of our true selves, and we live out of this idea of false self. And then what stares back at us in this mirror is just a hollow shell of what could be, rather than what God knows is reality. So Jesus, he wants us to embrace our true selves. That's what he's talking about today. He wants us to be self-aware and self-differentiated. That includes taking responsibility, you and I, for our own emotional and spiritual health. It means doing our own work and letting others do their own work as well. And it means being open and honest with one another, even when the truth that we hear and that we have to share is hard. For our true core to flourish, for God to flourish in this world, you and I must be set free from anything that holds us back from the love of God. And that is the kind of division that Jesus is talking about. It is what he initiates within us and asks of us. And that kind of division, it will never harm or destroy us. Instead, it liberates us so that we, you and I, can be fully present to the faithful work that God calls us to do here and now in this world. Thanks be to God. Amen.